So thank you very much, everyone, for coming to our webinar. This is actually 21st Ocean Nexus webinar. The webinar is supported by Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus, which is international network of researchers who are devoted their research to center social equity for ocean governance. So we like to argue, and perhaps not everyone in the network, but at least me, the social equity is equally, it's not more important for ocean governance than biodiversity or any of the natural events criteria that we actually usually consider. So this is really different narratives, and but I believe it's extremely important for us to address this issue, equity and justice, in a critical manner. So today, I'm really glad to have Dr. Eliana Ritts. Dr. Ritts has been working with me. I'm so lucky. Like 3 years officially.
Yeah, around 3 years. Yep.
Yeah. And so Dr. Ritts started as a postdoc, finished her PhD in anthropology, NYU, and studied postdoc at Harvard in LC Sunderland's lab. Finished her paper co-written with Jessica Vanderberg about cultural tipping point, bringing very new conversation in ocean and marine pollution. And then she came to URI for the postdoc, but spent most of the time in Cambridge, which I was really glad. She expanded our network, our perspectives, and it's been wonderful to work with you. And I'm so delighted that Dr. Ritts is going to be assistant research fellow in Taiwan Sinica Research Center. I think official name was different. I'm sorry.
Academia Sinica.
Academia Sinica. I'm sorry about that. And this is pretty much equivalent to tenure track professorship in that institute, but have much more time to do the research. Lucky you. And Taiwan is a wonderful place to be. So Dr. Ritts has been working in this media representation of indigenous and marginalized coastal communities. And today we're asking her to introduce us this just wonderful product, Driftline film, which we had a film festival based on it. And so, Dr. Ritts, if you're ready, can you give us your presentation, and then we discuss more about what's the purpose and what you have done with this collection of the films.
Sounds great. Let's get started. Can everybody see my screen? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, yes, thank you so much, Yoshi, for that introduction. And thanks everybody for joining. I know summers are a very tough time to actually sit down and get to your computer. So I really appreciate you all being here. And I'm really grateful to be part of this incredible webinar series. What I'll share today connects very closely with many of the previous sessions. And I see it as really continuing the conversation that we've been having over the past, I guess, 21 webinars, as Yoshi said. So keeping these conversations going, and I'm looking forward to hearing how this work resonates with you and your own work in our conversation after this presentation as well. So today I'll carry forward our conversation on ocean equity and justice by talking about the relationships between power, representation, and media in ocean governance, specifically through the lens of documentary film. So I will give you just a brief overview of the world of ocean documentary today and draw our attention to some of the challenges and problems that we're facing. Then I'll introduce the concept of narrative sovereignty and talk through what that might look like in the context of ocean film. And then I'll end by reflecting a little bit on implications for ocean governance. And I'll talk about Driftlines, which is a project that Yoshi mentioned, which is a teaching collection of films that I've been working on for the past year in collaboration with colleagues here at Ocean Nexus. So I'm really excited to share that and get some feedback around that as well. So I'll start us out by looking at some of the dominant ocean documentaries over the past 20 years. And here are just a few images of some of the films that have been particularly popular, particularly influential. You probably recognize at least a few. And films like this have historically played a really critical role in connecting people with oceans, in raising awareness about very important issues. But at the same time, many of these films, often inadvertently, end up reproducing colonial and capitalist ideologies, these ideologies that underlie a lot of the worlds of ocean governance and research today. And we see these colonial and capitalist ideologies playing out on screen in different ways. They come to life and they materialize in the narratives, in the characters, in the visuals on these films. And I'll just walk you through a few ways that we see this on screen. And I won't go in too much depth here. I think this might be familiar with many of you, but I'm happy to dive into any one of these. Could be its whole own presentation itself in our conversation afterwards. So on screen, for many of these films, it's very common to see white savior narratives, right? These films tend to center often white male protagonists, marine researchers, activists. It's their story that is the center of the film and guides us along. What tend to be quite simplified and linear storylines. Very often it follows the arc of the hero's journey. These films are also very full of epistemic colonialism. So, in terms of the knowledge systems we see on screen, Western science is privileged over other knowledge systems at the expense of other ways of knowing. There's also very often an aestheticization of crisis, which essentially means we see a lot of disaster imagery, suffering subjects, suffering people, suffering lands, waters, suffering animals, right, in a very dramatized and sensationalized way. Also, very common, particularly in environmental films, are this sense of acultural places, which is essentially these films filled with shots of oceans and coastal places, beautiful scenes, completely devoid of human life. So, this fiction or the myth of the empty sea, the mare nullis. And what this does is it effectively erases the long-standing relationships that many indigenous and coastal peoples have had with these ecosystems and these worlds. And unfortunately, when Indigenous and coastal peoples are represented on screen, it's usually through the lens of very specific tropes and stereotypes. So usually it's the victim slot, or perhaps a mascot slot as an emblem of a champion of environmentalism, or as these sort of noble, simplified peoples living in harmony with the ocean in very uncomplicated ways, right? So we see these tropes very strongly coming through. And these contribute to damage-centered theories of change, drawing here on Yves Tuck's work. And then the last things are that very often these films are marked by a very profound depoliticization, which essentially means that there's very little engagement with broader structures of power. And when accountability or responsibility are brought up, it's usually through the lens of the individual. What can you do as a single audience member, right? And also, there's often a lot of bad science in these films too. Many of our colleagues here at Ocean Nexus can wax lyrical about, in Seaspiracy and many other films, the science is actually not quite good. So we could go into this in much more depth, right? There's a lot more to say here. But what I actually want to do now is shift our analytical lens a little bit from the stories we see on screen to what we see off screen. So what's going on behind the camera? Because in order to understand these narratives that we see in the films, it's actually really critical to think about who's producing the films, who's directing them, who's funding them, right? How do these films get made? And so to give you a sense of that, here is a list of 13 relatively high-profile ocean films from the past 15 or so years. And this is not a comprehensive list at all. It's really just a sampling of films that had theatrical distribution, widespread viewing on popular streaming platforms. These are also many films that consistently make top 10 lists in ocean documentaries or environmental films to watch. And when we look at these films, we also see patterns emerge in the off-screen worlds. So we can see that the directors here are almost entirely white men from North America, Europe, Australia, that they are backed by very large production companies and often conservation organizations. And I also wanted to note that the language spoken in these films is overwhelmingly English, which connects to the language of production. The off-screen languages that were spoken when the film is being made is also English here. And so it might seem like a small detail, but all of this actually really matters. It's really, really important. And and the point here is not to criticize or to call out any single film, which could be done, but that's its own project. But to point out and to make visible these underlying inequities, these underlying power asymmetries, these structures that shape who is behind the camera and who is in front, who gets to direct, who has the resources to even make a film, right? And it's important because this is something that people aren't paying attention to as much in the world of ocean media, partly because it's just not as immediately visible as what we see on screen, right? And it's also critical to go one step further and note that this isn't just the way that we see mainstream media documentaries or popular documentaries, that when we look in ocean governance spaces specifically, we see the same power dynamics carrying through. So here is a snapshot of some of the films that were screened at the United Nations Ocean Conference in 2025 last year in Nice. And not many films were screened, and most of them were screened as part of side events. But when we look at the films that were screened, in terms of the on-screen narratives, we do see a shift. So these films do show us, they tend to represent more women on screen, more Indigenous peoples and perspectives on screen, social equity and social justice issues and calls for structural change and accountability, right? These are all part of the narratives that we're seeing here. But critically, when you look behind the camera, right, when you look at the production of these films, there actually isn't much of a change. And so the films are largely made by directors based in North America and Europe, often funded by conservation organizations. And the power gap between who is doing the representing and who is being represented remains. And so this is really troubling, right? This is really critical. And this is an issue that it resonates across many aspects of the ocean justice world, ocean governance world. And I want to take a moment here to actually call out why this is specifically a social equity issue, right? Because that's something that connects all of us here attending this webinar and being part of these conversations. So what makes this a social equity issue? And there is, of course, a lot that could be said, but I'm going to highlight two specific aspects of this. So one part of this is that these representations in these films are rooted in very long histories of misrepresentation, where we see a history of filmmaking, of documentary film, media, television, where we see racist and stereotyped imagery that dehumanizes coastal Indigenous peoples or erases their presence entirely. And we also see a lot of extractive imagery, where people's images and stories and knowledges are taken and appropriated in service of capitalist accumulation and colonial projects of domination, and actually often turned against people, right? Weaponized against them. And so what this means and why this is important is we can't talk about equal representation, right? Equal representation, equality isn't enough. And this is, again, part of the difference between equality and equity here. So because this is our starting point, this history is our starting point, instead of talking about equality, we actually need to be aware of the incredible reparative work that needs to be done, the healing, the countering of these stereotypes, the reversing of these colonial narratives in order to start thinking about what new narratives can be told. How do we change the stories going forward? So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is similar to what we've been talking about, but really highlighting the power dynamics of production, that the imbalances between who's in front of the camera and behind the camera actually reflect these broad structures of injustice and inequity that we see across the worlds of ocean research and governance, and also across media and film worlds too, right? This is a very prevalent issue. And in the same way that bad research can do harm on the ground, bad production processes also do harm on the ground. So all of this contributes to reinforce these dominant hierarchies of power. So this should give you a sense of what's wrong with the current world of ocean documentaries and film and the way that people and issues are being represented. And so for the rest of this time, I want to sort of switch gears and talk about what what could be an alternative, right? How do we move forward? How do we create narratives that don't replicate these old narratives of that are rooted in these sorts of ideologies? And so I want to focus on the concept here about narrative sovereignty. And I'm arguing that narrative sovereignty is a non-negotiable aspect of representational justice and equity in ocean governance. And narrative sovereignty is a concept that comes out of indigenous film and media worlds. And to give you a working definition, I'll share words from filmmaker, curator, and organizer Tracy Rector, who says, narrative sovereignty is the right of a group or community to control and shape the stories, narratives, and representations about themselves, their culture, and their histories. It's about having the ability to define and share one's own perspectives, experiences, and stories authentically with consent, agency, and care. And so over time, scholars and artists and activists have talked about this idea in different ways with different terms. So people have talked about visual sovereignty, representational sovereignty, media sovereignty, artistic sovereignty. And each of these approaches has its own nuance and specificity. But at its core, these ideas are about self-representation and control over the means of production. So here, particularly, about people's ability to tell their own stories and represent themselves on their own terms. And so to get back to ocean documentaries, the idea here is that who is producing a film, who's directing a film, who's behind the camera, and how these stories are being created, what, from my anthropological background, we would call the social worlds of production, that these all critically shape the content and the narratives that we see on screen. And you might be listening to this and thinking, like, of course, this seems quite obvious and self-evident. But actually, when you look at the kinds of ocean justice stories that circulate most widely today, the stories that we teach with also in our classrooms, this connection isn't being made. And that's where the problem really is. And we also see this in other media places. We see it in journalism. And so there's a great webinar that we had a few months ago on communicating environmental justice with Ocean Nexus and the Uproot Project, right? And so that's addressing many of these same issues in the world of journalism. And so these are all different parts of the same story. And so here we can see how prevalent this is in film. And as just a quick aside about my own connection to this topic, so I myself, I'm not Indigenous. I'm from the US. I grew up in California and New Jersey. And I myself have had the honor to learn about Indigenous narrative sovereignty firsthand from Indigenous media producers in Taiwan. So I've worked alongside really incredible producers and creative teams at Taiwan Indigenous Television for around 10 years now. And I'm sharing here a behind the scenes image of a shoot that we did for a television show focusing on intergenerational knowledge transmission with Indigenous Amis holders here on Taiwan's northern coast. And I'm very happy to talk more about any aspect of this as well in our conversation afterwards. But what I want to do now is keep continuing with the thread of narrative sovereignty and give you a quick example to actually bring to life what this looks like. So I'm sharing here two screenshots from two very different films that address the issue of coral reef restoration. So on the left, we have a screenshot from the film Reef Builders, which was directed by a British filmmaker, Stephen Shearman, and it's produced by the Sheba cat food brand. And what the film does is it spotlights the organization's coral reef restoration efforts, which they call Reef Stars in Indonesia, Kenya, Australia, and Hawaii. So it moves around. And in this screenshot, we see an interview with David Smith, who is the chief marine scientist and senior director of sustainable development at Mars. So that's one of the sides of this. Then on the other hand, we have the film The Forgotten Pacific. And this is a film that was directed and produced by a Fijian filmmaker, Elizabeth Koroivulaono. And in this film, Elizabeth works with Suluafe Brianna Fruin, who you can see on the right in this image. She's an activist and advocate from Samoa, who's also a leader in the Pacific Climate Warriors. And in the film, Elizabeth travels with Brianna across the Pacific Islands, and they meet with Pacific scientists, artists, and activists. And in this screenshot, it's from a section of the film that's set in Fiji. where Brianna is visiting Seru Salmakidonu, who's an environmental officer in Lilivia Island, who's leading a local coral reef restoration effort. So, even without watching these films, just looking at these two single frames, you can see a difference. And I'm going to walk you through what that is. So in Reef Builders on the left, we see a white male scientist centered on screen. He is our core source of knowledge. We see and we hear in the film as you watch it a great deal of epistemic colonialism. So knowledge is literally top down, right? It's rooted, he's in this sort of ambiguous office space and a upper level floor. So it's rooted here. And he's backed by these and legitimized by the structures of capitalism that made this film possible. And we also see a very linear and authoritative approach to narrative transmission, where he's the single source, the single voice in these scenes. Of course, other people come in throughout the film, but this is how the film opens and it sets the tone for the entire piece. But in The Forgotten Pacific, we see something very different. And this is one of the films that's included in the Drift Lines catalog that I'll talk about at the end. And so, as part of that work, I had the opportunity to chat with Elizabeth about her production process and the ideas behind the film. And what I want to do is share a couple ideas from those conversations to give you a sense of how she approaches this filmmaking in a very different way. So one core aspect for her is centering people who are Pacific experts on screen. So Pacific policymakers, Pacific marine biologists, Pacific knowledge holders. Those are the people who we see on screen, bringing us through these narratives. And we also, really importantly, see a very different style of narrative, because unlike the single person in the frame on the left, the entirety of The Forgotten Pacific is really driven by conversation, Brianna visiting different experts and dialoguing with them. And so this deconstructs the idea of any single source of knowledge or authority. And by using this dialogic narration, we represent a very different understanding of knowledges as multiple and co-created. So that's also very critical. And then the last thing is about the location of where these two screenshots take place. And so here I'm going to share directly Elizabeth's words about how she picks the locations for her films. So Elizabeth says, "We position interviews in place. If we're talking about water, let's be in the water. If we're talking about land, let's sit in the land. For instance, we put ocean scientist Alisi Rambukawaka on the Uto ni Yalo, a traditional waka that is so iconic in Fiji and across the Pacific. And when we talk to Sam, we go to the mangroves. It's different from other media, but because it's how we know things, it's also how we interview." And so there are many other differences that run throughout these films. And here are a few behind the scenes production shots from the making of The Forgotten Pacific that Elizabeth shared during the process of the filmmaking. But this comparison hopefully gives you a sense of some of the ways that the off-screen social worlds of production resonate on screen and how these two sides are so inextricably interlinked. And so I would say we're nearing the end because we are, but I actually really feel like this is our starting point, right? Because once we start to recognize and understand how significant these off-screen worlds of production are, and once we are grounded ourselves in the idea of narrative sovereignty, then we can really start to talk about how powerful and transformative narrative sovereignty can be, and how films that center narrative sovereignty can shape ocean governance in many ways. And this is really important because I think a lot of times people might say, in the world of ocean governance, what we really need is more data, more modeling, right? Films, art, all of this is just kind of secondary stuff. But I would say when we talk about representational justice, we really need to understand and be attuned to the ways that legal and political justice are inextricably related to media representation, right? All these forms of representation work together, and you can't separate visual representation or media representation.
Hi, everyone. It seems Ellie is frozen. So I'm just gonna wait a little bit and see if Ellie can come back online. We good?
I'm back.
Okay.
My internet cut
Yeah.
out.
Great to see you again. Ellie, so you stopped. Do you remember where you Oh, you don't
Yes,
know
I
where
do
you're
remember where
frozen,
I
but
stopped.
you do. Okay,
Yeah.
brilliant.
Okay.
Please do continue. I'm going to mute myself now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, so just last few bits here, but so the ways that some of the ways that narrative sovereignty can impact ocean governance is by shaping the broader public narratives that are behind public opinion and policy decisions. And so, for example, the film The Shiranui Sea is part of a series of works made by Japanese director Noriaki Tsuchimoto about Minamata Bay and the poisoning, mercury poisoning in Minamata Bay. And this film and many of the others that he worked on really helped to both reduce public stigma around people who experienced the worst impacts of the mercury poisoning, and also to demand accountability from the Chiso Corporation that was responsible for the mercury pollution and the government that was complicit with the company. Another aspect of this is that these films also often can directly inform policymakers. So the Forgotten Pacific film that we spoke about earlier, that was screened at the 2025 Bonn Climate Conference, right? So there's value in getting these films before the eyes of the people who are actually about to make important decisions. And these films also play a really critical role in communicating information to at-risk communities. And so, as an example here, um, one of the films in the Driftlines collection, New Boats, is by Barmy Boy, who's a director based in Sierra Leone. And this film addresses many intersecting ocean equity issues set in the port town of Tombo in Sierra Leone. But in addition to actually making this film, Barmy Boy travels around Sierra Leone to different communities, particularly fishing communities, but also many other communities. And he hosts local screenings as a way to educate people and spark conversation, which then enables people to be more active in political process and governance process decisions when their representatives come to visit. And the final aspect that I'll talk about here is pedagogy. So films are, I believe, incredibly powerful teaching tools. And screening these films in classrooms is a critical part of shaping the next generation of ocean leaders. And so to that end, I've been working on Drift Lines, which is a teaching collection of films that center ocean justice and equity. And so this is a collection of films from around the world, um, predominantly not in English language. They are all subtitled in English, but it was really important for us to have English be the minority language in this group. And they're connected by a very uncompromising commitment to narrative sovereignty and also relational production. And I could talk about those nuances later as well. But the idea is that we can inspire teachers to use these films in their classrooms as a way to counter many of the mainstream narratives and provide different ways of knowing that are not necessarily driven by scholars and academics writing articles as ways to engage with these really critical issues. And so I'm just going to very briefly show you the website that we've been working on, which I would love for everybody to take a look at if they have time. And particularly to offer feedback, because right now we're really in a position of developing the website for teachers. Oh, let me see. Can you see it yet? No.
Not yet.
Here we go.
We can now.
Okay, so this is so when you look at the site, we've divided the 20 films into 5 different themes to make it easy to fit into ocean related syllabi. And for each film, for each theme, if you click on the theme, there's a brief overview, and then there are 4 different films. So, for instance, this is a film set in St. Vincent and the Grenadines about whaling, part of the food sovereignty theme. And so there's basic information, a trailer, a synopsis, and an introduction to the director, and then access information, so where the film can be viewed, as well as some teaching resources. So we have relevant articles that can be used to provide additional context and information because a film, it can't, I mean, a film you can watch alone, but films are always in conversation with other sources of knowledge, with other films, articles, books, etc. So the idea is we're giving some sort of context for these as teaching resources as well. And then for over half of the directors as well, I have been really grateful for the opportunity to have conversations with them. And so we have a PDF catalog that has actually full introductions to each of the themed sections from members of the Ocean Nexus community and interviews with the directors as an additional resource. So we're really encouraging people to start working with this in their classrooms and sharing feedback with us. And we'll add an additional teaching tab once we get feedback that actually provides tailored teaching resources for different kinds of classroom environments. So on that note, I'll just say thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of these ideas, and I'd love to hear from you what resonates, how this might fit in with your own work, and where we might take the conversation forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ellie. That was excellent. I learned so much. So I'm just going to ask a few questions, and anybody who would like to join the conversation, you can put your question in the chat, or there's a Q&A. Either way, you can put those, and then we can I'm going to bring it up to Ellie. But first of all, Ellie, it's really wonderful that you just pointed out this, whole trend of seeing films and now as a communication tool to in many times to really let the people to understand what's the impact of the climate change, how the state of the ocean, how important it is for us to engage with conservation. So usually they say there's a science and it's very complicated, so we have to make it easier for the people to understand, and then that's the function of the film. Now, the film that you're talking about, it's more ethnographic. It's really to stop us to study down, it's really for us to co-develop, and it's also being very self-reflexive, that why am I making the film? Who am I to speak about these? So, people, and then potentially, I don't know whether those production people might actually say, look, it's a different function. We are trying to hit the mass audience to spread this very important message that climate change is impacting us, and you are doing something different. So why do we have to follow the way you do? Why can't we just have authority in telling about the science, which is quite legit? And okay, potentially we get the money from some cat food company because they've been exposed that that a lot of fish catch coming from South America are actually given to cat and dog food, which nobody actually talked about. I think it was exposed about like 15 years ago, not at least more recent. So Shiva suddenly decided to just fund something easier to fund. So what would you like to say about that? It's a different function and it's a different perspective. You do what you need to do. We do what we can do. Why can't we have this platform? They may say that.
Thanks, Yoshi. It's a great question. And I'll say two things on that. So the first is that you're absolutely right. I think a lot of times people think that the goal of film is to simplify, to make these complicated narratives easier. And that's what we often see in those more mainstream dominant films that we looked at the very beginning. And I think with these films, it's exactly the opposite. So part of what these films do, and many of these films are created over 3, 4, 5, 7 years. And so they actually show the incredible complexity, the lived complexity of how these certain issues are experienced on the ground. And critically, because these are films, and I think this is something that actually sets film apart from other art projects, because I think there are a lot of similarities in terms of arts and films, like the emotional aspect, different kinds of connections that can be made. But film particularly can really show how complex these issues are, because as we know, ocean equity problems are not experienced in isolation, right? They all connect, they all come together. And this is part of the reason why efforts to do box ticking or indexes don't work. And so I think these films actually show that very clearly because they are full of complexity. They're full of different kinds of excess, and they don't let you reduce anything to a single narrative. And I think the other thing your question brings up is a really, really great point about the motivation, right?
Mm,
Why these films are made. And
mm,
so often for films, like again, if you think back to the original, that spreadsheet where you see who's funding these films,
mm,
a lot of the films that we looked at from a mainstream perspective are funded by conservation organizations, and they
mm,
have a very clear agenda.
mm,
And that agenda is different from many of the films that are focused on in this sort of a more narrative sovereignty or
mm,
relational filmmaking framework. And so, one of the things that I heard very often in my conversations with directors, and something that's also very common to hear throughout Indigenous media worlds, is that the primary audience for these films, why directors are driven to make them, is for their family, for their community, for
mm,
their peoples.
mm,
And that's their first audience. And if they do wrong by that audience, they have no business making a film.
mm, mm.
And that I think is a really critical way to understand one of the core differences that resonates then throughout the entire film production and visual worlds on screen.
Mm. I think in some ways that we're not completely negating the value of those mass-produced film. They could carry some of the messages, and then they could carry the some scientific evidences which people can be very critical about and can actually speak against it. So this is some, this is one representation of one knowledge in one form. But the fear that we have is because it's such a mass production and it's so well distributed with a very strong capital behind it and also the network behind it. What we fear is this becomes a dominant voices, and then unfortunately they are not addressing that power. Is that what you're saying? Is that's the motivation? They don't really hide. They're very blunt about it, but at the same time, there is a way we can actually fight against it. So, my second question is, do you know that you addressed the way the Forgotten Pacific has been shot? They shot in certain places, carrying the understanding in a process of representing the knowledges and also really to understand how the film language can be composed by setting up the right locations and the right places. The another question is it really, can we actually fulfill our understanding of not being extractive by being technically tuned, so the method of the film, or should we actually more focused on the message? I'm sure they both come together because it's a film language, but if you can just explain a little bit about that, that'd be great too.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. And I think it is so the on-screen, the technical aspects, the on-screen parts of the film language are a really critical part of this. And I think they're often things that are linked to the message and they convey messages in a very profound way. So
Mm,
actually this is a really interesting part of using drift lines as a teaching collection. So part of one of the resources that we have in the PDF booklet is actually just a guide to help professors who have never taught with film in their classroom to get their students to think about film and to watch films critically in a different way. And so to that end, we ask professors to, and this is inspired by my own anthropology professor, Dr. Faye Ginsberg, who has been a great inspiration for all of this work. But we ask professors to get their students to divide a piece of paper or a screen these days into three different columns. And so
mm,
one column is about the narrative of the film. So that's where people might write down the more obvious message-based things, as you say. So the key themes, maybe quotes, plot points. But then the second category is the visual and sonic worlds, or the
mm,
other representational worlds of the film. And this is where the film language that you're talking about really comes through. And so it's a very different level and mode of communication, but
mm,
it connects with the film. And then the third category is what the film makes you feel. Because we, as we watch the film, of course, we bring our own backgrounds, knowledge, embodied reactions, all of these different things. We bring that to our own experience as viewers. And so these three things, I mean, many other things connect, but by kind of identifying and isolating these three things as points to really try to focus your attention on as you watch the film, then that lets students or any audience members really start to see the connections between the three.
I see. So it's a bit connected. But one of the questions coming from Delia, thank you very much, Delia. By the way, Delia is again working with us to do research with Dr. Ritts this summer, analyzing the film has been shown in those events and big corporate type of showing. She was just basically asking, if you know anything about how those films are selected at UN meetings and others, which are like big meetings. If you know anything about like behind the scene of the selections.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I don't know that much, and I think that's a really important area for future for research and understanding. What I would say is that it's likely a very politically driven process. So, for
Yes.
instance, when last year in Nice, you saw certain films that were featured by French production companies that might not have been selected if it was in a different location. So, I think there's a nationalist element to it, and then
Mm,
I think there's a
mm,
funding element to it. So, who
mm.
has the power and the resources to distribute and get their voices and their films heard and screened in these spaces. Um, and I also think it's representative of internal inequities within existing ocean equity or ocean governance organizations. So, for instance, there was a film in Nice that was a film screening of, centering women filmmakers and women marine biologists and women in this working space, but that was predominantly featuring white voices and white producers. And that, as we know, is a very common bias within the world of white feminism and
Mm.
white efforts within marine biology as well to get more women in. There's still a really substantial issue around lack of racial representation.
Thank you. So it's a lot of network, and I'll go even a step further. It's a network has been created for the very single purposes, which is bring more capital, and
Exactly.
push forward certain policies. Unfortunately, and this is really coming from not being reflexive and using the film as a communication and in teaching, turning you down kind of like a tools rather than using as a film luggage of for us to understand what is going on as an analytical mode. So one of the questions from Nadia is asking, look, there's Nadia, if you don't mind me paraphrasing for the time, it's basically how can it's so much of the colonial, the coastal coloniality is really coming with a violence. And how can you film or how can film actually make any change? And when people make a film, what's the way not to disturb narrative sovereignty, which you talked about? Shall we just use something like FPIC, the formal, hang on, I hate this word. Um, the uh, uh, policy, no, I'm so sorry, my mind was somewhere else. But FPIC is informed consent, which is written in
Mm.
often free prior. Thank you. Yeah, free pro. Do you know what? I'm studying this, but the free pro or informed consent. Yes, thank you very much. It's written in United Nations Indigenous Rights Convention, so it's kind of like a given as a way to get a yes. I have a problem with that, but I'll pass it to you, Ellie. How can we actually protect narrative sovereignty and then also use it to defy those violence and coloniality in the coast by using a film?
So I think just as a, I mean, thank you, Nadia. It's a great question. And also, I'm just looking at the way you phrased it as
Mm.
well. So I think your point that making films in these larger structures that are shaped by co like customary marine tenure and colonial media limitations and frameworks
Mm.
is a really important one. And that's one of the great challenges around narrative sovereignty that a lot of people have to find ways to sort of work within the system without being bound by it. Sort of stretching the limits, right? Or finding ways to tell their own story um, while still acknowledging that this broader system of media production and film production and documentary work is going to be inherently shaped by colonial concepts from the beginning. And so I would say that there are a couple of things that are really important. I mean, having native or indigenous led spaces is really critical. And
Mm.
so part of what many indigenous filmmakers talk about is how important it is to have not just the director be indigenous, but also the entire crew and the catering. So when you go and work in a specific place, actually, instead of flying in, food from wherever else or working with non-indigenous caterers, actually working with indigenous caterers, and there's many different kinds of reciprocal relationality that come out of that. And I think that point of relationality kind of gets to the second part of the question too. The FPIC process, I also would have problems with it, Yoshi. Like it's not. Um, Well, I won't say what it's not. I will say what is needed is truly relational accountability and truly relational filmmaking. So, one of the core aspects, and this is similar to a lot of research, best practice research as well, but foregrounding relationality. So, Alanisa Bomsawin is a really iconic Canadian filmmaker, and she's often referred to as one of the grandmothers of Indigenous cinema in Canada. And she practices what has been called a cinema of listening, where she just goes to a location without a camera, just goes there to meet with people and talk to people. And sometimes she has a recorder, sometimes not. And she just has conversations with people and she listens. And that is so critical. And that happens months and months before she even starts to bring a camera in. And so there's an emphasis here on relationships over the purpose of the film is not to create a film, if that makes sense. It's to build these relationships and actually to
Okay, Karen, is that me or it's Ellie just frozen? Oops. Okay, could be me.
needs an interest in output. You just
Okay, again, Ellie has some internet issues, but I'm sure she's going to join again. Um, so while waiting, my issue, I think I should speak. My issue with FPIC is how FPIC can set more contractual based relationship between people who's coming into the community and people in the community, and then that's one I think the most critical issues that FPIC actually presents to us. Another one is FPIC actually follows quite uh, Western basis of getting a consent. So the consent is has to be developed through the relationship development, but FPIC is really trying to just shorten the way to create the contractor base. Okay, Ellie's back.
I'm sorry, my internet anyway. I'm joining on my phone. Sorry for these
Right.
last couple minutes to avoid more
Okay,
issues.
okay. Thank you. So we're talking about Epic. I just explained to the people why I have a problem because Epic actually create a relationship, which is more contractual rather than something to build on, and it actually shorten the space of the time that we actually should spend to get to know each other between community and the subject. But so that was my criticism. But you can continue to speak about like okay, what do you so continue to Nadia's question, what is really that we can do to protect narrative sovereignty by using a film?
So I think I would say it's about thinking about the worlds of production, right? Because that's where narrative sovereignty really starts.
Right,
I think the answer to that question depends on who the we is, right? So
right.
if the we is us here at Ocean Nexus, or that's even itself a very complicated we, but it's the we is myself as a non-Indigenous researcher. It would be me not going into a setting and making a film myself where I know there's an Indigenous or a local director or filmmaker who could make the same film, right? I'm not taking up spaces, resource, or funding from other people who can and should be telling those stories. There is space for relational filmmaking. So there's an example in this. in the Driftlines catalog of a filmmaker in Taiwan who was called by a fisherman in Jinmen, which is it is a Taiwanese island, but it's off the coast of Taiwan and it has a very different culture. A fisherman called him and said, "Can you please come and make a film about what's happening here?" And so that's a different kind of relationship, right? But it's those relationships that make that kind of filmmaking work. So I think I would say if the we is just from my perspective, it would be understanding where are your stories to tell and where aren't. And then if it's not your story to tell, what are you asked to do? How do you work alongside people? Another key thing on a broader, I guess, we in the world of ocean governance, perhaps, is thinking about redistributing funding for films. So, for instance, if you were Patagonia and you were they have all these film series, right? Don't give your funds to another director based in like the UK who does a lot of documentaries about a lot of different topics. Actually, to go into Sierra Leone and make a film. Instead, go to Barmy Boy, who actually has a whole film operation in Sierra Leone called Freetown Media, where he provides capacity training on the ground, works with other local filmmakers and media producers, right? Find people on the ground who are doing that work and support them. So I think that from a broader we perspective would be another way to protect narrative sovereignty.
Thank you, Ellie. I have one last question. I have many friends who are filmmakers and they're not anthropologists, not ocean governance, and then they just wanted to go in and shoot the people, and then they work very sincerely with the communities, but they have this artistic, inspiration which they might actually shoot and then narrate things community might actually not like. With those artistic inspirations, if it conflicts with narrative sovereignty, how can we work with that?
I mean, do you want my honest answer?
Yes,
we
please.
Don't make those films. There's a great, actually, I'm just going to end, if you don't mind. I'm going to share my screen again and end with a quote that directly addresses that from a director. And I actually would like to end with a voice that's not mine anyway. So let me share I can't share my screen because I'm on my computer. Okay, on my phone. I'm going to read the quote. So this is a quote from Virginie Tatufa, who's the director of the film Tapuna Ora, The Source of Life. And she also runs a production company based in Tahiti. And so she talks about these very specific dynamics. And so she says, most of the film crews in Tahiti are French. And instead of hiring a local producer for the film, they just hire a sound engineer or someone in a smaller production role so they can say they have local participation. And I think as a side note, the reason I don't talk about collaborative filmmaking here is because people talk about collaborative
Oh, shoot. Okay.
Filmmaking all the time. I think so she says, so they hire a sound engineer or someone in a smaller production role so they can say they have local participation. But the rest of the crew comes in from France or other places in the world, and they do everything themselves. They shoot and they go home. There's no involvement of the local people other than the people they are filming. And if they have a participant who is actually from the place, and that's not always guaranteed. And even in those cases, and this I think is key, the people are often just a pretext for filming. So she goes on to talk about how directors will often say, oh, these fishermen have a problem, let's film it. But they really just have their own almost vanity project. They love to go diving, and Tahiti's so beautiful. So they just go in and they film, and then they leave. And maybe the knowledge they've gained is helpful. Maybe it's something that people already knew or don't care about, right? But the people aren't actually consulted or engaged in meaningful ways. They're just a pretext to go in and get funds, right? Take funds away from other more meaningful projects that could be made and make these films. So I think that what you're saying gets to the heart of some of these broader structural problems.
Yes.
And why narrative sovereignty is so critical to start to think about something different.
Thank you, Dr. Ritts. It's been great conversation. I learned tons of it. Keywords such as narrative sovereignty is very important for us to revisit all the time. And then we're hoping that we're going to have a filmmakers in this conversation for the next webinar, which you probably participate from Taiwan. So excited. Yeah, Taiwan's so lucky. Yeah, and we're going to continue working together. Thank you very much, everyone, to attend this webinar. And I thank those two who actually gave us the questions. And our next webinar is going to be in September. We're going to have July and August off, but so many collections in the 21st so 21st webinar is on the web, on the YouTube. So if you can actually enjoy and feel your time during summer. Thank you very much again, Eliana.
Thank you so much,
Great
Yoshi.
work and
Thanks,
great
everybody.
conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.